Um, well, I haven't done a PowerPoint or slides, so I'm afraid you just have to listen to me chat. My name's Alison Ronan, or Ali, and I'm really interested in what happened to the women. I was always interested in, I think I'm always interested in, why would you do something that makes your life a bit tricky when you could stay at home and just do what you're told? So that has been my life, really. I'm always interested in what makes people stand up and be brave, really, and I've always, up until now, I haven't had to do that myself particularly, so it's something I'm really in awe of, people who make a stand for something they believe in. So I began my research really in Manchester, looking at what happened when the war broke out in 1914 and whether there were women, what happened to the women in the city. So I'm not really a suffrage historian, because of course Manchester has a famous kind of suffrage history, but I learned pretty quickly that there were networks of women before the war, suffrage women in Manchester, suffragists, majority of them, who were involved in the trade union movement, who were involved in the ILP, and who were working with working class women in that city, and also taking the word out, as it were, through an informal relationship with the Labour Party called the Election Fighting Fund, when they came up to areas like Nelson, Burnley, Blackburn, Accrington, to talk to working class women, rather in the way that we saw Selina do in her speeches, about why it was important to have the vote, that it wasn't just a thing about wanting to be equal with men, but it was about having a voice. So those networks I could see were already there. And I began to realise that, as Cyril has said, what happened when the war broke out was that people had to make a decision about where they were going to place themselves in position to the war. And of course you have the Quakers, Manchester particularly is a big non-conformist city. You had Quakers, Baptists. I don't think we had any peculiar people, though. Perhaps everyone in Manchester is slightly peculiar. And you had those people who very clearly said, no, we're against the war. You had other people who had a different kind of opposition to the war. Again, you had people in the ILP, you had people in the British Socialist Party, you had anarchists, people who were beginning to look at the war in terms of class, in terms of the arms trade, in terms of militarization, capitalism, a capitalist war. And really, when you read some of the things, the speeches that people were making, some of their speeches could have been made yesterday or very recently, the things that were concerning people. So you have this going on from 1914. People knew that conscription was on the cards, really. So in 1914, in the autumn, Fenner Brockway, who at the time was the editor of the Labour Leader, which is the radical paper in Manchester and in the whole country, printed in Manchester, his wife Lilla suggested to him that they began an organisation where they could begin to gauge how many men would be interested in standing up against conscription. And this is really the beginning of the No Conscription Fellowship. And from that, you begin to see that once conscription starts, you begin to see other things happening. So you get a maintenance committee in Manchester, and I think others in other cities, that was organised to provide food, clothing, money for the men who had been put in prison. Because what I didn't realise, and I doubt that anybody generally realises, is that if you went to prison, your family didn't get any money. You didn't get a soldier's allowance or anything like that. So quite often women with families, even if they were working in the mills, they actually didn't have very much money to look after their kids, to feed their kids. And in the Working Class Movement Library, the Hyde papers for the Hyde branch of the No Conscription Fellowship remain, and we have some amazing documentation which shows how that kind of maintenance committee was organised, got names and addresses, and this allows you then to begin to see exactly what Cyril is talking about, where people were. So I really have this idea that a lot of the things about conscientious objection, it was about your beliefs, about your feelings, about what you were prepared to stand up for, but it was also about the people you knew. People who could support you in that. It's a big decision to make. And people knew that they were under surveillance, they knew there were detectives in the room. I can't see any here today, but in the past they would have known that there were detectives in the room. Quite often, if there was a meeting like this, the detectives would come in and pick up the men who were eligible and take them off. I think I'm right in that. So we have a lot of evidence about that people were living in fear, really, of being picked up. So I then became very interested in something called the Women's Peace Crusade. It's not very well known. It's hardly in any books, as far as I can tell, mainstream books about the First World War. This was, again, there was a movement, as I've said, a movement against the war. The women were involved in that. You have the beginnings in 1915 of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where women in England tried to go over to a meeting in The Hague in Holland, where about 1,200 women from belligerent and neutral countries were meeting to talk about peace. But Winston Churchill closed the channel on some pretext, and Charlotte's made a wonderful film about that, which you can watch on YouTube, called These Dangerous Women, which is what Winston Churchill called the women who went down to Tilbury Docks and waited for a week while the channel was shut, and therefore missed the conference in The Hague. So you've got this swell, really, of internationalism, of pacifism, of socialism, of a critique of capitalism, really. In 1916, a woman called Helen Crawford from Glasgow, who had been instrumental in the Glasgow rent strikes, where they mobilised women to campaign against the profiteering, really, of the landlords who'd put up the rents as people came into Glasgow to work in the dockyards, to work in the arms industry up there. And I mean, they're great stories. They would ring a bell when the bailiffs were coming because they hadn't paid their rent, and the women would tip flour over the bailiffs, and they would do all kinds of things. And so they learnt the way to mobilise women. They would have meetings after the shifts. They would have meetings in places where women could go, where women felt safe. So there was that whole thing about they understood how to mobilise the women. So in 1916, in the summer, Helen Crawford organised a meeting in Glasgow Green to talk about lobbying the government to negotiate for peace. They weren't saying stop the war, you can't just stop a war, but what they wanted was the government to begin to think how they were going to negotiate for a peace. A huge amount of people turned up. Speakers came from all over the country, speakers from Manchester, speakers from Leeds, Bristol, came women, because of course by that time a lot of the men were in prison. And from that you had a series of crusades that went right across the country. By 1918 there had been 123 crusades in almost every industrial city in the country, and usually there were 2,000 or 3,000 people out on the street. They had their own badges. They made, they were blue. Peace is the colour of blue at that time, though I think that's kind of gone off the radar a bit now. They quite often, children would be singing. They wore blue sashes. They made banners, and there's some wonderful stuff out on the boards about Nelson one, where you can see different factions coming together to support this. So I was really interested in this because it is something that's really been largely forgotten. Jill Liddington has written a little bit about it in some of her work, and it comes up in her lovely book about Selina Cooper. But really, there's a great deal more work to do, I think, about the whole country, about why and how it was developed. We could find out particularly about the Nelson one because the Labour leader ran a regular column about the Women's Peace Crusade, which was edited by Ethel Snowden, who came originally from Nelson. And in that column, every week, they would put down the secretary of each branch of the Women's Peace Crusade. Although I have no evidence that those branches were more than an informal meeting. Nobody seems to have kept minutes or anything like that. No evidence of that, which is why it may have been kind of ignored and overlooked, because there's not very much archival evidence of it apart from in newspapers. So probably about 4 years ago, we made a film and a book. It's good for if you're doing charades, nobody would ever guess it. And we worked with volunteers. We have a few here, the wonderful Denise, and I can't see anyone else, but all wonderful people from Nelson, Burnley, Blackburn, Accrington, Oldham, Rochdale. We had some people tell us about things that happened in Stockport, Manchester. So we had a lot of people. We used to meet regularly in Manchester, get very excited and feel rather important. And we put together this book, and it tells us about what I want to call the kind of unknown, the ordinary socialist people, the ordinary socialist woman, the women that just get forgotten in the telling of the tale. So here in Nelson, we got to know Gertrude Ingham, that we've talked about, whose son Alex was in prison. Gertrude Ingham worked very closely with Selina Cooper in the ILP and sort of orchestrated the crusade here. There were other women like the wonderfully named Nancy Shimbles, who lived the next street along, and she had died very suddenly. I think she had appendicitis when she was 38. And Nancy Shimbles is a great woman, socialist, regarded herself as an internationalist, pacifist, worked for the Weavers Union, ILP, and really, I think, had a great future ahead of her. And she died very suddenly. And the crusade here in Nelson was held in her honour, the wonderful Nancy Shimbles. And I think there is a picture of her on Nelson Station. I think you have to know what, I don't know, she's at the back somewhere, but there she is, the wonderful Nancy Shimbles. And all kinds of women, once you begin to look, I think Denise and I spent a day in Burnley Library, didn't we, years ago. You begin to see other women like Deborah Smith, other women that you just don't know very much about, and you can begin to track some of them. The other thing we found when we were there was, of course, that people were quite often hiding people. Men were being hidden by their families, so men might come home on leave and not return. People might be hidden all through the war, in fact. I think Barry in Burnley is doing, Barry from Bolton is doing quite a lot of work about that. So not only were people on the run, but there were also people who were hidden or were encouraged to stay in houses, safe houses perhaps. And you find that in Nelson. So I suppose what I want to say is you've got the wonderful stories about the conscientious objectors, but you also have to think about the families, the women who were left behind, the women who were really holding up that half of the world, okay? And what happened to them and how they got to, you know, you can see that women got to know each other, the Quaker women who, you know, I suppose rather stereotypically we might think quite quiet and quite gentle, were with some very strident, marvellous socialist women. You've got women who, in Manchester at least, had women's meetings, so they would all get together, they would decide to create journals, they could keep each other in touch with what was going on. And I'm just in awe of them really, because I think they knew they were being watched, they knew their lives were difficult, and they just kept on. And it's been an absolute delight to get to know Nelson and Burnley, where they seemed rather away when I first came, but now I feel quite at home here. Even though I'm not even from Yorkshire, I'm a Londoner in my heart. So yeah, so a big thank you to Nelson for welcoming me and allowing us to do all this wonderful work, to Charlotte for doing the wonderful film, and to this building for doing such a fantastic job in bringing some of the past to life. So thank you very much.
Housing revolutionaries. Well, thanks Ali and Cyril. I'd like to invite everyone to come upstairs.